Just a reminder, you can catch me recording this podcast live on AMP. AMP is a new live radio app that lets you call in and chat with me in person while recording. Get the app on Apple's App Store and make sure you follow me at John Middlekauff to get notified when I go live. What is going on, everybody? John Middlekauff, 3 Now Podcast. Go subscribe wherever you may listen. If you're watching on YouTube, hammer that like button, subscribe to the page, and check out all of our content. As you can see, wearing a Flex Fit 3 and Out hat. Go to thevolume.com, Go check out our merch. Copy you one of these. Fits great, looks good. Got trucker hats as well for 3 and Out. Also the Volume, new logo, looks sharp as you can see in the video. Thevolume.com, go check that out. A lot of football news that happened over the last 24 hours we will dive into. Exciting times. Football is kind of unofficially back. I'll consider it officially back once the pads come on. But we have training camps and veterans all reporting over the next, I'd say, 24, 48 hours, beside the guys that are holding out. And best time of year, man. Doesn't get much better in August because that means games, real games, not preseason games, are right around the corner. So let's get excited. I know that I am. But before we dive into everything football related, I went to Morgan Wallen last week. And my friends, the number one ticketing app in America, the official ticketing app of 3 and Out, Gametime, took care of me. So what I need you to do, I need you to go to your smartphone. I got one right here. Download the Gametime app and use the promo code JOHN, John, when you sign up for your first pair of tickets. You will get $20 off. You want to go to a game this fall, football game, college or pro. Obviously, baseball is just the heat of the summer, baby. The dog days. Go watch your squad play. Concerts. I can't recommend Morgan Wallen enough. Concert was elite. I went back-to-back nights because of Gametime. Use the promo code JOHN. Get $20 off. Have yourself a ball. Take your son, take a brother, take your wife, take your dad or mom, and just go enjoy yourself at an event and do it on me. Promo code JOHN, the Gametime app. Number one ticketing app in America. Where do we want to start football-wise? Well, let's start with James Garoppolo. And listen, Jimmy Garoppolo has a long, extensive injury history. Some guys do, right? Some guys get hurt a lot, and some guys, for whatever reason, are Iron Men and never get injured. It is the one thing in pro sports that you just never know. A guy can have a long resume of injuries and then just play several years and be, perfectly fine. And a guy that has been available his entire career can just start getting hurt constantly at 30 years old or 33 years old or 28 years old. You never know. This is something, there is no perfect formula for this. But I would say in my experience of watching sports, and I would imagine a lot of people listening to this who are, if you're my age, in your 30s and your 40s, even if you're in your 20s, you've been watching sports long enough, there are certain guys who get injured a lot. There are other guys who are just more available than others. And I would say if you stick with investing and signing and drafting guys that have proven having availability, you give yourself a better chance. But you could sign Reggie White or Lawrence Taylor or Peyton Manning or whoever in their prime, and they could have an immediate injury and their career could end. That's just the nature of the sport of football. We'll dive into some of the early injuries, but it happens in OTAs. It happens in training camps before the pads come on. It happens in preseason games. It obviously happens in the regular season. It's one of the sad parts about what I would consider the greatest team game in the world. Sorry, soccer fans. But I do think the Raiders are on a very slippery slope. Josh McDaniels has hitched his wagon to a guy who last year at this time could not pass a physical. So if you want to say that Jimmy has improved his availability, because at this point last year in the late July, he wasn't even available. It took till the end of training camp for him to be able to pass a physical. Now, granted, he couldn't pass a physical the majority of 2022, but this is a guy with countless injuries. From his feet to his knees to his hand to his shoulders. He gets injured a lot. And he's a good player, but he's not really good, right? You're not signing Peyton Manning like the Denver Broncos did in 2012. You're not signing Tom Brady like Tampa Bay. This is a guy who is very dependent on who is playing around him. And luckily in his career, the couple games that he had to start, when Tom was suspended and his time in San Francisco, he's at a pretty freaking good team and really good head coach. Now, Josh was the offensive coordinator for his time in New England and those couple games that he started before he got injured in the second game when he injured his shoulder. But the one thing is, being a coordinator and being a head coach, we've all learned is completely different. And looking at Josh's, honestly, his record is actually better than I thought it would be when I looked it up. It's 17-28. If you said, John, what do you guess Josh McDaniels' record as a head coach? I would have been like 15-40. So it's better than I thought. But he's proven to be below average as a head coach. From the eye test, even if you give him a little bit of a pass, John, Denver Broncos a long time ago. Okay. Well, I witnessed last year, Derek Carr coming off the best season of his career, have the worst season of his career under him. And the team being unable to win any close games that mattered until the season was basically over. And at the end of the year, it just didn't matter because they won 6 games. So when you hit your wagon to a guy, a quarterback, right? You get rid of Derek. Okay, it's football. He didn't get it done. He doesn't fit your system. Like, listen, he's been there 9 years. I got no problem with that. I had no issue with them moving on from him as a quarterback. But to hit your wagon to a guy who is always injured and to have no backup plan, right? I mean, their backup quarterback is Brian Hoyer. And the other thing is your third best player, right? Devontae, Max Crosby are 2 best players. Josh Jacobs, I'd say, is, if not on their level, right behind. Just got seen getting on an airplane leaving. Now, doesn't have a contract over the dispute of the franchise tag, but I think it's fair to say that he's not going to be around all of training camp. So you're going to be very dependent on him. And we've seen this with running backs, can be very hit or miss when they're MIA all of camp, who is kind of a one-season wonder. Now, he's been a good player when he's been on the field before 2022, but he never had a season quite like that. I just think that this situation with the Raiders could get ugly and could get ugly really fast. Now, a couple weeks ago when I did kind of my hot seat rankings, I didn't put him on just in the simple fact, I don't think Mark Davis wants to do another coaching search. I don't think he wants to pay a guy to go away. But if Jimmy Garoppolo gets injured, as he always does, and all of a sudden you're with Brian Hoyer and some other random quarterback that you're going to be forced to sign, and your season is derailed and you're looking at a 3 or 4 win team, and we start talking about Caleb Williams with you at the end of October, this thing can get ugly, and this thing can get ugly fast. Vegas is about the stars, the bright lights. You pay premiums to go to shows, and they've been lucky, right? Lucky is the wrong word. They have changed the landscape of the city by adding professional teams. The Vegas Knights just won a championship, right? That's a fact. I mean, they are the best team in the NHL. And you could say the NHL, hockey teams are clearly the 4th team in basically every market. But when it comes to Vegas, who have only had a football team now for a couple of years, looks like they're getting a baseball team and do not have an NBA team yet, like the Knights did it right. The arena is sweet and they kick ass. Well, the Raiders, their stadium is pretty cool. I've never been inside, but I've got virtual tours and I've driven by it. It looks badass. They did it right. The facilities are awesome. The team has not been good. And the team last year was an embarrassment. And this thing can get ugly fast. It really can. And I think they're hitching their wagon to a guy who is just not the most dependable individual. No fault of his own. Like, I don't think Jimmy wants to get hurt, but he does get injured a lot. And their coach has proven to just not be very good. So I got the Raiders massively red flagged. One thing that I never enjoyed as a scout, or even when I worked in college football, the pit in my stomach, the lack of ability to control anything is just when you're at practice in training camp, you could be OTAs as well, and a guy goes down and the entire place, if there are fans there or not, goes completely silent. Everyone knows it's a major injury. And the sad reality when it's a pile, depending on what position group is involved, you're just praying to God. Like, I'll just use the 49ers as an example. If it's D-line and O-line stuff and there's a pile and someone is not getting up, you're like, I hope to God that's not Trent Williams or Nick Bosa. And then when you see that it's someone else, it's a weird feeling because it's like a sense of relief. And then the cart comes out and it's a sense of then also devastation because a guy's clearly had a major injury. And it's something that I have anxiety even thinking about. I hated that feeling. But coaches, especially longtime coaches and definitely longtime executives, I don't know if you ever get numb, but their ability to move on to the next play, to the next drill with injuries it's pretty impressive. And part of that, and you could argue in any industry, I'm sure I have people listening to me from every business, from car sales to doctors to people that work in sports. You become, in a sense, numb to certain things. Like you've been to a hospital, not proud, but I remember when my dad was really sick, the doctor came in and basically said, like, he's not actually alive. So the ventilators are the only thing keeping him alive. And this is well before 2020. And my mom couldn't do it. So it was on me and my brother. And the devastation in that room with our family, this guy says this every day to people. And I'm not saying that guy ever gets numb to seeing life disappear. But after you see it enough, I mean, that doctor has a perspective when people tell him, like, yeah, I guess you got to pull the plug. That us in that room, anyone listening that has been through that, the feeling in our room of pure devastation. I mean, the worst thing that can ever happen to you is something he sees on a daily basis. I don't know how they cope with it, but clearly you have to. That's the profession you're in. And they deal with life and death. When we're coming to football, you're just dealing with careers. But when I see today that Gardner Johnson, the former Eagles safety, I think he led the league in interceptions last year, who's now in the Lions, carted off the field. You're going to see that a lot more this week. Non-contact injuries, guys being carted off the field. And some of them are just going to be freakouts and it's going to be okay. He just sprained his knee. And others are going to be devastating knee injuries or torn pecs or, dislocated ankles, whatever. And it's the worst part of training camp. I don't even think there is a close second. But the reality is, and I've held the sheet, is the GM looks at you if you're, the assistant GM or you're one of the scouts. And when I was with the Eagles, I used to hold it in my pocket. Technology's changed it a little bit, where you'd have a tangible piece of paper with the short list. So when you lose a guard or when you lose a safety, you have a list of other safeties on the street, and you immediately go to work with setting up workouts or bringing in a guy to immediately sign, because that's just the business you're in, and there's just no avoiding it. And it's something I do not miss. I don't even like reading about injuries, let alone, but if you're Belichick, if you're Pete Carroll or Andy Reid, you've seen this now for 40, 50 years. And I'm sorry, you're around something long enough. I don't want to say I hate using the term numb, but you definitely get used to it. And you definitely get used to the mindset of just next one up, next man up. Now, there are certain players, and I haven't seen this yet, but there is no next man up when you lose a high, a tier 1 player, when you lose a blue chip all pro. And you just kind of got to keep your fingers crossed, whoever your team is, that every day during training camp, it's why so many teams now don't play anybody. And I give Sean McVay credit. I thought it was crazy. I'm like, you're not going to play anyone during the preseason. I'm in agreement with him. Now, I know Belichick and Andy and Tomlin, some of these old school coaches still play some of their guys. But I think when you factor in the money and you factor in just the importance of, if you're a good team, the 7-8 core players on your roster, especially the older they get, they would never play a snap for me if I own the team. That would be a mandate I'd have. I'd say, listen, I don't meddle with draft picks. I don't meddle with signings. I will give you whatever you need to do. My only mandate is, I'm sorry, whatever the list is, if it's 5 guys, if it's 9 guys, they're just not, we might lose them when games come, but the game's got to be a real game, not a preseason game. And last but not least is, I remember when I was in college in like 05, 06, 07, and then I went to work with Fresno State and seeing some of our guys get drafted really high, there wasn't a rookie wage scale. And anyone, if you're of a certain age, remembers when guys like Ndamukong Suh and Sam Bradford, and most famously Jamarcus Russell, they got enormous sums of money. I mean, you're talking guys, Bradford, $60 million. Jamarcus Russell, this is almost 20 years ago now, before he had ever taken a snap. Again, this pre-inflation and everything, I think got well over $40 million. And then when the new CBA happened, I think it was in 2011, remember the lockout, the rookie wage scale, I think, made the league a lot healthier. And I think, you've seen, if you're a Colts fan, if you're a Texans fan, if you're a Panther fan, you're going to see all these quarterbacks have signed their contract. And basically, I think Anthony Richardson was like $34 million. I think Bryce was 37 or 38. That would mean CJ's, 36 and a half, $37 million, fully guaranteed. This is a fully guaranteed 4-year contract. And they're signing bonuses. I could pull it up. I think it's, 25 to $28 million. They get guaranteed. Now, if you hit on those quarterbacks, those first 4 years at that number, averaging whatever, under $10 million a season, is the best contract you will ever sign. But the law averages will show us minimum 3 of these guys are just not only not going to be franchised quarterbacks, probably inevitable backups, right? They're going to be quote unquote busts. Like Zach Wilson. I saw a headline the other day. I think Saleh feels like the Jets, reported a little early to training camp, and a lot of positives coming out about Zach Wilson. Saleh kind of singing his praises. Like, I'm sorry, I'm calling bullshit. There have already been rumors. I think Rich Cimini wrote that the Jets fully believe, and Aaron Rodgers communicated, it would take a devastating, like he plans on playing the next year. Zach Wilson's contract will be up. You're not picking up his 5th-year option, right? So he won't be on the Jets in 2 years. Hell, he's not guaranteed to be on the Jets the fall in 2024. Like that, if they had a do-over on that one, I got news for you. They would do it over. If they got a do-over on that one, they wouldn't even take a quarterback, because beside Trevor Lawrence, and I was pounding the table for Justin Fields, there is no guarantee that any of those guys would have been worth the pick. There is still an unknown on Fields. Mac Jones, to me, under no circumstances could be a top 10 pick. And Trey Lance and Zach Wilson, if you could redo that thing, neither one is sniffing the first round. Now, that doesn't define their career. They could go to other teams and resurrect their career. We've seen it happen countless times. Hell, Geno Smith just did it last year, and he had bounced around the league for a while. But the wage scale, what it used to be, whatever the equivalent would be now, right? If Sam Bradford in whatever 08 is getting $60 million, factoring inflation, the cap, I mean, we'll be talking $100 million contracts for these guys, right? At minimum 85. And it's much easier to pivot when you screw up with $35 million than it is triple that number. So the wage scale has made the league a lot healthier. I think from a locker room standpoint, the reason Belichick used to always trade down. Now, for the most part, he was drafting in the 20s, but even then, he would trade back sometimes. He would get out of the first round. He didn't want a guy in his locker room making $3 or $4 million that had never proven shit, when he had core guys who he'd won championships with making $6, right? So you're like, wait, I've been on this team for 4 years. I'm making $5.5 million. We just drafted this guy who was great at Illinois, who has never proven anything in this league, and he's making $3.5, $4 million. I make $1 million more than him. The blood, sweat, equity I've had in this franchise, which it still happens today, right? CJ Stroud or Bryce Young hasn't proven anything, but people can understand it, even if they're a bust. But it's a lot difficult for good teams, competitive teams, to have guys in their locker room that right away aren't good, making an astronomical amount of money. So it's not perfect. More than likely, a lot of these guys are not, most years are not Jamar Chase, Micah Parsons, Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, Penei Sewell, just guys that are like, they're worth every penny. They're underpaid. Most years are like, yeah, half the top 15, we'd want to do over on that bad boy. And I think it's made these contracts a lot easier to get done. I've had some people DM me if it's, listen, most of you I'm sure know this. This is a pretty remedial comment here, but ask me if it's draft position purely, or does the position you play also factor in like it does with franchise tags? It's just draft slots. So if you're drafted 2, the number is the number. Whether you play running back, Saquon Barkley got what he got as number 2 pick, whether he played running back or whether he had played quarterback. CJ Stroud was getting what he gets regardless of the position. So it's purely on the draft slot. And we can argue a lot about different things the league has done, some of the rules, some of, I think training camp now that starts, as someone that's been going to training camp for well over a decade. I do think it's difficult, and I've never played in the NFL, but I've been around enough old school players, and I watch football, in the 90s. it feels like, and I'm very adamant about this, there are way more injuries now because in boxing, I'm not a big MMA guy, not even the biggest boxing guy, but I followed enough to know, and all you got to do is watch some of these Conor McGregor documentaries or Floyd, that you spar leading up to the fight. Why? To build calluses on your body so you can take it, right? You use that physicality to get ready for the actual fight. Football is no different. Now, I'm not pounding the table here and say we should go back to Junction Boys, Bear Bryant, no water breaks, triple days. But for example, and I am pretty sure this is an NFL rule, and a lot of teams do this. I know the Niners go 3 days on, 1 day off, and their double days are not allowed. So the amount of practices you have before even week one relative to what it used to be 15, 20 years ago, when I don't have the evidence in front of me, but I'm pretty confident there are way less injuries. And it makes sense, right? You practice to get good at football. You have to practice football. And the only way to play football is with pads. This is not baseball where me and Pedro Martinez, it just can be us two. And I could get an AB just like I would in the big leagues, right? Or it's not basketball where even if it's not an NBA game, if we get 10 NBA players, we can have a 5-on-5 game, even if we're just wearing our own shit, right? It can be real basketball. In football, OTAs and even what you see early in training camp has nothing to do with actual football once you put on the pads. The run game, the fits, the tackling. And honestly, no one tackles in practice anymore. And I don't even blame them. But it's just considered quote unquote thud for those people that, have never played football. It's basically, it's a little more physical two-hand touch, but it's a hard little pop, but there is no wrapping up and there's definitely no taking to the ground. It's why a lot of the fights that you'll see in training camp are when you go to the ground. Now, granted, there were fights in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. There's always fights in training camp. It's hot. People are edgy. You're tired of hitting your teammate. But it's a lot different now. And I'm a big believer that it's very, very difficult to get ready for week one when you don't practice. And I would imagine most coaches, they don't really talk about it as much because it feels like you're making excuses, and anything you say to the media kind of, drips down to your players. So they just kind of take it for what it is. But if you get them off the record, if you know them personally, they'll all bitch and moan about it. They think it's kind of a joke. And they're not looking to kill anybody. They understand that you got $10 million, $15, $20 million assets on your squad, right? You're paying these guys a lot of money. But the way this training camp works out, man, it's just, I'm not trying to act like some tough guy. I never played in the league. But my first year in the NFL with the Eagles was pre-CBA. And it was a pretty physical training camp. And I know Kelsey's talked about this. Relative to the NFL, Andy's training camp is still really physical. Belichick pivoted where he's still a physical training camp too. But like he uses that first month, it doesn't matter as much anymore because his team's not as good. But back with Brady, they use that first month to really kind of training camp because that was the time they could be physical and tackle, that he could kind of gauge his squad, who was good, who was not. A lot of it's a guessing game. You can make pretty strong, educated guesses when you're evaluating your team, but it's still pretty hard, right? If you got your second string guy and they're just doing thud, like, would he have made that open field tackle? Would he have? I don't know, because you're not actually tackling. And if he's not putting that spot in a preseason game, you just kind of keep your fingers crossed. So it's a really fun time of year. It's a very complicated time of year for the teams to try to get the most out of every rep. And depending on where you are, some teams have it better than others, right? The weather in Seattle is not as, clearly as warm or humid as it is in Florida, or it is in North Carolina, or some of these places like Philly or Pittsburgh, right? So I enjoy it. I enjoy the chess maneuvers of putting together training camp and trying to avoid these injuries, man, because they can really derail a season.